The Peasants Revolt in 1381 was caused by a combination of economic, social and political factors that had been brewing for some time. In 14th century England, the peasants' daily lives were defined by poverty, hard labour and limited freedoms. Most lived in small villages, toiling as agricultural labourers on land owned by the nobility or the church. The majority were serfs, legally bound to their lord's estate. The rights of a serf in medieval England were limited and heavily constrained by the feudal system. They did have some protection under the law. Their freedoms, however, were significantly restricted. They were required to work the Lord's land, pay rents and other taxes. They would also be called upon for extra seasonal work without extra pay, and also for forced labour projects such as repairing roads and bridges. They could also be asked for special payments. These included the marriage of the Lord's daughter, the knighting of his son, or if the Lord himself was ransomed from captivity. Lords and officials held immense power over peasants' lives. Failure to fulfill obligations could result in them being made outcasts. They could have fines or even imprisonment imposed on them. Any protests or resistance were swiftly crushed. Adding to their burdens were the church's demands for tithes, requiring peasants to give a tenth of their produce to support the clergy. Yet the church's immense wealth, coupled with the corruption of some clergy, sowed deep resentment amongst the poor. Lords were technically limited in the taxes they could impose on serfs, though in practice, many serfs suffered from excessive demands, leading to uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt. As in France and all Europe, the population of England had been decimated by the plague in the years 1348 and 1349. Between 30 to 50% of the population had died, and the lords didn't have enough serfs to work the land. This initially led to rising wages for the remaining peasants. To counteract this, new laws were enacted by the aristocracy, and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 fixed wages at pre-plague levels. What the peasants were experiencing in England was by no means exceptional. Europe had many peasants' revolts around about this time. In France, for example, the Jacquerie of 1358 was caused by heavy taxation and the destruction of peasants' lands during the 100 Years' War. French peasants in northern France attacked nobles and their estates. The uprising was brutally suppressed, with thousands killed. One of the biggest and most relevant contributors that finally led to an outright revolt in England was the imposition of the poll tax in 1380. The government of King Richard II implemented a series of poll taxes to finance the ongoing 100 Years' War with France. The tax was regressive, imposed at a flat rate on every individual, regardless of income or social status. The burden fell disproportionately on the lower classes, who were already struggling economically. By 1381, the weight of these hardships became unbearable. Taxes and the enforcement of oppressive laws created a boiling point. After the poll tax was levied, it was seen not just as another financial burden, but as a symbol of the systematic injustice that ruled their lives. These conditions forged a unity amongst the peasants, who began to recognize their collective power. The revolt that followed was not merely an outburst of anger. It was a desperate cry for survival and dignity in a world that seemed determined to deny them both. John Wycliffe, born in Yorkshire around 1320, was a scholar, educated at Oxford. Wycliffe became a theological reformer, challenging the power and the wealth of the Catholic Church. His enduring legacy was translating the Bible into English, making it accessible to a wider audience. Wycliffe's ideas, like predestination and the authority of Scripture, influenced Protestant thinkers like Martin Luther and Jan Hus. His criticism of the Church's power resonated with those seeking to redefine the relationship between Church and state. Radical preachers like John Ball spread revolutionary ideas and criticized the social order. He preached about equality, justice, and the inherent dignity of all individuals. His message resonated with the oppressed peasants, encouraging them to challenge the existing power structures. Simon of Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, found himself at odds with Ball's outspoken views, which led to Ball's repeated imprisonment. He was likely excommunicated, and in 1366 a ban was imposed preventing anyone from attending his sermons. These measures failed to silence him or curb his influence. Instead, Ball adapted by addressing gatherings in churchyards following formal services, where his following continued to grow. By 1381, Ball was held in Maidstone, Kent, when the Peasants Revolt erupted. Freed by the rebels, he joined their cause and delivered a passionate sermon at Blackheath, their meeting point near Greenwich. Sharing his bold message with the assembled crowd, he said,
"When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of bad men. For if God would have had any bondman from the beginning, he would have appointed who should be bond and who free. And therefore I exhort you to consider that now the time has come, appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if ye will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty."
The specific starting point of the revolt is often associated with the village of Fobbin in Essex. This is where the local tax collector attempted to enforce the poll tax in a particularly harsh manner. This led to a confrontation between the tax collector and the villagers, resulting in violence. One of the ways the collectors would seek more money is by forcing their hands up the skirts of young girls whose virginity would be checked, as married women would pay taxes. Remember, at this time, many of the peasants would still see the aristocrats as outsiders, foreigners, invaders. The ruling class still leaned heavily on French, a Norman legacy, while Latium dominated the church and in law. Peasants spoke English dialects. This reinforced social divisions. On their way to the major gathering in London, the rebels launched attacks on several towns. Each action a strike against the institutions and individuals they held responsible for their oppression. In Rochester, they stormed the castle and freed prisoners, focusing their anger on local officials seen as enforcers of harsh laws. In Canterbury, they demanded the removal of corrupt church figures and were specifically seeking Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was deeply unpopular due to his role in introducing the third poll tax. Though he was not in the city at the time, their hostility towards him was clear. At St Albans, the rebels demanded the release of serfs and the abolition of manorial dues. In Bury St Edmunds, they attacked the Abbey and targeted John Cavendish, Chief Justice of the King's Bench. He was captured and killed as a symbol of royal authority. So many of the people that would have gathered from the southeast of the country would have come here, Blackheath. This was a major common land area. It's still a very large park today. And they'd have gathered in their thousands, talked about strategy, experiences, hardship, and the shared bond they had, the shared common goal they had to change the situation, to change their lives, to change their outcomes. The first bridge across the Thames was built by the Romans in the late 1st century CE at Londinium, where London Bridge now stands. For centuries it was the only crossing, rebuilt several times, most famously as the Great Stone Bridge completed in 1209. Astonishingly, no other bridge was added until Westminster Bridge opened in 1750. There's been a bridge close or on this site since the time of the Romans. At the time of the Peasants Revolt, this would have been a living and breathing city bridge. Buildings were on it, houses, shops, a chapel, traffic jams. It must have been quite a sight rather than this quite bland bridge we have today. It would have also had gates, security, locking the bridge down in case of troubles. So for the peasants to have been allowed access, someone must have been sympathetic to their cause and let them in, let them cross. Once inside the city, the crowds had certain targets, but general looting ensued also. The rebels, peasants, artisans and discontented townsfolk moved with fury through London streets. Their main enemies were clear. The legal rolls and records, symbols of feudal dues and oppressive taxes, were dragged from chests and set aflame. The homes of royal officers and tax collectors were stormed. Most famously, the Savoy Palace of John of Gaunt was torn apart, looted, and then burned in a blaze so fierce the stones cracked with the heat. The prisons were thrown open, their captives released in triumph. The Inns of Court and the Temple, training grounds for lawyers, were sacked, law books cast onto bonfires, as the law itself was seen as the chains of the poor. Even the priory at Clerkenwell, belonging to the wealthy Hospitallers, was torched. For their prior, Sir Robert Hales, was hated as the king's treasurer, but what followed shocked even sympathetic observers. Chroniclers tell of cellars of wine being drained, mansions smashed to splinters, servants slain or scattered. Treasure discovered at the Savoy was hurled into the Thames so no one could claim it, though many doubted the rebels' restraint, and blood flowed. Judges, lawyers and royal officers were dragged from hiding, summarily tried and beheaded. At the Tower of London itself, Archbishop Simon Sudbury, the Lord Chancellor, was seized and taken to Tower Hill. There, before the roaring multitude, He was struck down and his head displayed alongside the others. For days, London teetered on the edge of anarchy. Chroniclers describe mobs dragging supposed informers through the streets, striking terror into bystanders, and turning even on former allies. To many, it seemed as though the city had slipped from royal rule into the raw grip of the commons, vengeful, chaotic, and impossible to control. The rebels believe they are destroying the chains that bind them. At the centre of the storm stands a boy king, Richard II, only 14 years old, and a man leading a rebellion that we know little of. As peasants filled the street and unrest spread, the aristocracy, the king and his advisors were forced to confront the crisis directly. Faced with a rapidly growing uprising, they had limited choice but to open a dialogue, to parley with the leaders of the rebellion in the hope of restoring order.
And on the 14th of June 1381, Richard II came here to meet with them and talk with them. They must have thought their demands would be met, and he appeared to meet them, as well as signing their charter. But this was not the end. It was the beginning of a very disastrous next couple of days.
Richard appeared to agree and granted charters of freedom. However, rioting in London continued at the same time, so even during negotiations, the violence had not stopped. This would have caused the king and his advisors great alarm, but also a great hatred and contempt of these peasants. The following day, Richard met the rebels again at Smithfield. Their leader, Wat Tyler, demanded further reforms. Wat Tyler was said by those who wrote the history of the event to have been disrespectful. But of course the very nature of this rebellion would have been considered extremely disrespectful to begin with.
So it was here that Wat Tyler met his end, Smithfield Market. Came face to face with Richard II and his troops. Was seen to be disrespectful, and was cut down, stabbed through the neck by the Lord Mayor of London.
During the tense confrontation, Lord Mayor William Walworth attacked Tyler. Tyler was stabbed and then cut down by royal soldiers. The chroniclers tell us that King Richard rode towards the rebels and said,
"I am your king. I will be your captain. Follow me."
Confusion spreads. Without Tyler, they don't know what to do. Royal troops quickly move into position. The rebellion begins to crumble. Across the countryside, royal forces hunt down the remaining rebels. Many flee east into Essex. Some gather again near the village of Billericay.
So it's here, somewhere in these woods, in 1381. The last remnants of the Peasants Revolt were chased down, hunted down by the King's Guard, by the King's men, and captured or slaughtered. Norsey Wood, Billericay. The peasants would have sought some sort of refuge to come together and perhaps produce one last stand against the king, against the authorities, but the king's men chased them down, hunted them and chased them down, and captured them or killed them. It would have been a pretty gruesome end.
We know nothing about Wat Tyler. He sprang out of nowhere in history. There's no reliable documents about his life before 1381. We think he came from Kent. He may have been a craftsman or a small farmer. He had leadership abilities. Now, many speculate that he may have had some training in the military. He may have actually fought in the 100 Years' War, but that's speculation. We don't know anything about him. But John Ball, the priest, one of the ideological leaders of the revolt, did undergo the full, hung, drawn, quartered. His body was cut into pieces and displayed in different towns as a warning. Royal commissions travelled around the southeast of England, Kent, Essex, Hertfordshire, East Anglia. Dozens of local rebel captains were hanged, beheaded, or otherwise executed for treason. Some towns saw executions carried out in the market square, where the revolt had begun. Once order was restored, all of the promises Richard II had issued at Mile End, the charters of freedom that had been granted, were of course revoked. Richard later declared, "You were and are serfs, and serfs you shall remain." The social system remained largely intact. The revolt only lasted a few weeks, but the punishments were meant to ensure that no similar uprising would threaten the crown again. So in 1999, this spike was erected here. Some feel it represents the spiked heads that were placed at the south end of London Bridge throughout its history. From the 14th to the 17th century, hundreds of heads were placed here, including Thomas Cromwell, Guy Fawkes, and Wat Tyler. In 1405, about 24 years after the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the people of St Albans built a clock tower in the town centre. During the revolt itself, St Albans had been one of the flashpoints of resistance against monastic power. The townspeople forced their way into the abbey's authority structures, destroyed legal records, and compelled the abbot to grant concessions that briefly loosened the abbey's grip on justice and taxation. Those gains did not last. The revolt was suppressed, and much of what was won was later reversed. So when the clock tower rose in 1405, it was not an open rebellion, but something quieter. A deliberate act of independence from the abbey that still dominated town life, controlling markets, law, and even the ringing of the bells that marked daily time. By building their own clock, the townspeople were reclaiming something fundamental, the rhythm of their lives. And though the peasants' revolt had failed, its pressure hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed shape into stone, into time, and into something harder to take back.